Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. Cults often go against mainstream society in their beliefs and practices, and are usually led by charismatic, if not mysterious, leaders. Recent sociological and historical studies show that cults are now being considered as religious movements, since most of them derive from already existing religious beliefs. Here to tell us about cults as religious groups is Robert Campbell, an associate professor in the Department of Humanities at the University of Toronto. Thank you very much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
Now, why don't we start, I guess, by maybe defining or talking about what is a cult or what makes a cult?
Well, I think cults have been around for as long as there have been religions, but certainly our modern interpretation of these things is a kind of a splinter group, as you said, usually led by someone who, has a slightly different take on things and is a charismatic individual, can attract the attention of the young or the impressionable, and will spin their version of a tale and hive off a separate community for themselves. Mm-hmm. And in very often, certainly emerging in the late 60s and 70s as kind of part of the counterculture movement, you really had people who kept to themselves and moved away from the mainstream. And so what they were doing was kept private. They recruited usually by word of mouth or through friends or through contacts, and people lost contact with individuals, and so a lot of mystery and mystique, if you like, grew up around these movements. They generally tended to be rather small because in a cult, the person in charge generally wanted to control every aspect of your life, what you thought, what you ate, who you associated with, how you dressed, etc. And of course these things became very scary because they were going against the mainstream of culture. But historically, cults grew up. Jesus led a cult among the Jews. It's just the idea of an emergence of a new idea within a religious framework.
Well, and perhaps it is almost I'm struggling to find the word, but religious-centric to look at cults as aberrations when in fact they have coexisted side by side.
I think I get that's an interesting word, religion-centric. I suppose it is. The one thing that we associate most often with religions is their longevity. People always ask, well, which one was the first one? Which one has been around the longest? Which is kind of the question of ultimate truth disguised in another way. If something is 2,000 years old, that must be true. If it's something 4,000 years old, maybe that's truer. If something's 2 weeks old, it's not likely that it's true.
But maybe that, in fact, speaks to some of the appeal, that we live in a culture that is so rooted in the now that, in fact, someone who has just discovered the secret or has just discovered some new type of knowledge, there's an appeal in that.
Absolutely. This is marketing. This is new and improved. We just, change the model a little bit and bring it out. It has a great deal to do with the quest for variety, the quest for excitement. Routine now. People did the same thing their whole lives, used to do the same thing their whole lives, and they had a basically stable life. Stability now is questionable. People change jobs continually. They change their ideas continually. Through the internet, through media of all types, they have exposure to any number of new ideas, and they will pick and choose. They'll do something, this feels good this week, let's do this. They might go through a short period in that and move on to something else.
So, I mean, is it safe to say that cults are being normalized, that they're becoming sort of recognized aspects of modern culture?
I think they are being normalized, but I also think that they don't have quite the solid appeal that they used to, particularly in the 60s and 70s with the kind of the rebellion. It was moving against the mainstream, and individuals would kind of get, in a sense, trapped in these groups. Now, I'm not convinced they're as much of a threat because you can change them the next week, just like you change the music you listen to or the other things that you do. And so from that point of view, they've almost been, people have been desensitized to a certain extent to them because, like everything else, there's just so much of them, so much of everything else.
Almost like a cultural relativism.
Almost like a cultural relativism. It's, flavor of the week. If you don't like this cult, look another one up on the internet and carry on.
Well, and it's interesting that, you've raised the internet as I would bring it back to that cultural relativism. Do you feel that the internet is a natural breeding ground for cults or a natural place for people to explore the diversity of spiritual belief?
It's a natural place to explore, and it's also a natural place for everyone who has a new idea to have an instant audience, or at least attempt to gain an instant audience. And, they can do all kinds of things to attract people to their sites. They may, in fact, these might, in a sense, become self-fulfilling. The person created it, moved on, and people are basically following through looking for this. Person comes back and says, "Whoops, I've started something. I better put some attention back on those things."
Well, and we hear often the phrase in pop culture of the cult of the individual.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you see often that our type of culture, because we worship individuals so much, that it leads towards these types of
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you know, people have spoken about cult leaders. You know, when you think of David Koresh, or you think of Jim Jones, or people like this. I'm a little more afraid of Britney Spears than I am of these individuals in that respect, because basically you're talking about an individual who affects the daily lives of millions of teens, not 100 people or 1,000 people, but millions. And it dominates how they think at school, how they behave at school, what they wear, how they talk, the way they interact with their parents. That's a cult.
Well, and we are seeing really a shift towards a celebrity culture that, to me, almost resembles an aristocracy, that mixing in with what you're saying sounds like there are all these cults that have tremendous influence, yet we don't have the literacy to understand.
I think that's part of it, and you know, with all due respect to certain individuals and certain organizations, Scientology has to be probably the best example. When you've got John Travolta and Tom Cruise and all of these individuals as your front man, how can you help but be successful?
Right. It's just the marketing.
It's just the marketing.
Well, thank you very much. Certainly this has been quite an interesting discussion, and I hope allows us to see cults not so much in a negative light, but in a balanced light, so that we understand the influence that they have on society. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Robert Campbell, an associate professor in the Department of Humanities at the University of Toronto. Next on 3D Dialogue, Kabbalah and its practices. Please stay tuned.